It is a Friday morning in October 1086, and the most powerful Christian king in all of Spain is grinning. Alfonso VI of Castile sits atop his armored warhorse on the plains outside a town called Sagrajas, staring across the field at an enemy army that appears to be doing absolutely nothing. Thousands of Almoravid warriors are kneeling in prayer, their backs turned to the river, their weapons at their sides. Alfonso cannot believe his luck. He has spent 3 days exchanging messages with their commander, a 70-year-old desert warrior named Yusuf Ibn Tashfin, and now he is convinced the old man has made the fatal mistake of leaving his army exposed at the worst possible moment. Alfonso gives the order. His heavy cavalry, the finest armored knights in the Iberian Peninsula, lower their lances and thunder forward in a charge that should end this battle before it even begins. But Yusuf Ibn Tashfin is not panicking. He is not scrambling. He is calmly strapping on his armor, because everything that is about to happen has already been planned. Alfonso VI has just ridden straight into a trap 3 days in the making, and he is about to meet a secret weapon that will shatter his army, destroy a generation of Christian nobility, and halt the Reconquista dead in its tracks. That weapon is not a blade or a siege engine or some exotic piece of foreign technology. It is something far more devastating, and the Spanish king will not understand what hit him until it is far too late. To understand how one afternoon on a dusty plain in western Spain reset the balance of power across an entire peninsula, you have to understand the two men at the center of this catastrophe. Alfonso VI had spent 15 years building a reputation as the most feared Christian monarch in Iberia. In 1085, he had achieved what many considered impossible. He captured Toledo, the ancient Visigothic capital, from Muslim control. That single conquest sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. Toledo was not just a city, it was a symbol. Its fall meant that the fragmented Muslim kingdoms of southern Spain, the Taifa states, were on the verge of total collapse. Alfonso imposed humiliating tributes on them. He styled himself Emperor of all Spain. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that nothing could stop him from driving Islam off the peninsula entirely. And that arrogance, that absolute certainty in his own invincibility, was exactly what Yusuf Ibn Tashfin was counting on. Yusuf was everything Alfonso was not. Where Alfonso was loud and aggressive, Yusuf was quiet and methodical. He had spent decades fighting brutal campaigns across the Sahara Desert, forging the Almoravid Empire from a collection of Berber tribes into a military machine that stretched across North Africa. He understood something that Alfonso did not. War is not won by the strongest arm or the heaviest armor. War is won by the commander who controls the shape of the battlefield before the first blow is ever struck. And that is precisely what Yusuf did at Sagrajas. When the two armies arrived at the field near the town of Badajoz, Yusuf made what appeared to be a catastrophic blunder. He positioned his forces with their backs to the Guadiana River, cutting off his own line of retreat. Alfonso's scouts reported this, and the Spanish king nearly laughed. A commander trapping himself against a river was a textbook mistake. Exactly the kind of error you would expect from a desert nomad unfamiliar with European warfare. But Yusuf had not made a mistake. He had made a choice. By placing the river at his back, he forced Alfonso to approach from the north, funneling the Spanish army into a single avenue of attack. He was not trapping himself. He was creating a killing ground and inviting Alfonso to walk right into it. Then came the negotiations. For 3 full days, messengers rode back and forth between the two camps. Yusuf proposed terms. Alfonso countered. Yusuf suggested postponing battle to avoid fighting on certain holy days. Alfonso, impatient and itching for combat, agreed reluctantly. What he did not realize was that every single hour of those negotiations was a weapon. Yusuf was not negotiating in good faith. He was studying his enemy. He was watching how Alfonso's camp operated, observing the Spanish deployment, measuring response times, and most importantly, he was preparing. Every hour that Alfonso spent fuming in his tent, convinced that the old Berber was stalling out of fear, was an hour that Yusuf used to position his forces with surgical precision. By the time Friday morning arrived, Yusuf had turned the battlefield into a machine, and Alfonso was about to throw himself into its gears. Now here is where things get truly extraordinary, because the force Yusuf had assembled was unlike anything the Christian knights had ever faced. The Almoravid army was built in layers, each one designed to serve a specific tactical purpose. At the front, Yusuf placed the Taifa allies, the soldiers from the fragmented Muslim kingdoms of Spain. These men were adequate fighters, but they were not the core of his force. They were expendable, and Yusuf knew it. Behind them stood the real killing power of the Almoravid machine. Professional Berber infantry, hardened by decades of combat across the Sahara, bound together by a puritanical religious zeal, and the kind of discipline that only comes from surviving the harshest environment on earth. These men did not fight for glory or plunder. They fought as a single organism, and the instrument that held them together was the real secret weapon of Sagrajas: drums. Massive war drums positioned throughout the Almoravid formation, operated by dedicated drummers whose sole purpose was to relay commands from Yusuf's position to every unit on the field in real time. In 1086, battlefield communication was primitive almost everywhere in the world. European armies relied on visual signals, shouted commands, and horn blasts that could barely be heard over the clash of steel. Once a cavalry charge began, a commander essentially lost control of his knights. They became individual warriors, each fighting his own private battle, deaf to orders and blind to the larger tactical picture. Yusuf's drum network changed everything. With rhythmic patterns that his troops had drilled on for months, he could order infantry to shift formations, signal missile troops to launch coordinated volleys, time the commitment of reserves down to the minute, and maintain command over thousands of men spread across a chaotic battlefield. Alfonso had the heavier armor and the bigger horses. Yusuf had something infinitely more dangerous. He had coordination, and hidden behind the Almoravid infantry, completely invisible to Spanish scouts, waited the final piece of the trap: an elite force of Black Guard cavalry, warriors recruited from Senegal and trained specifically for fast, coordinated mounted attacks. Alfonso had no idea they were there. His intelligence had described a conventional, larger army, and he had planned accordingly: smash through the center with heavy cavalry, scatter the infantry, and run down the survivors. It was the same strategy that had won him Toledo, that had made him master of central Spain. It had always worked before. It was about to fail catastrophically. When Alfonso launched his Friday morning attack, his knights hit the Taifa forces first. The forward screen of Spanish Muslim soldiers crumbled almost immediately, scattering in every direction. Alfonso's cavalry plowed through them like a battering ram through a wicker fence, and for a few glorious minutes, it looked like the battle was already won. But that was the trap. Those Taifa forces were never meant to hold. They were meant to absorb the momentum of the Spanish charge and, more critically, to fragment the Christian formation. Heavy cavalry derives its devastating power from hundreds of armored riders hitting a single point in a concentrated wall of steel and horseflesh. Once that formation breaks apart, once knights start chasing individual enemies in different directions, they lose the very thing that makes them lethal. And that is exactly what happened. By the time Alfonso's cavalry reached the Almoravid center, they were strung out, disordered, and breathing hard. Their horses were winded from the initial charge. Their lances were broken or discarded. They had already won one battle and were riding headlong into another without realizing they had already lost their greatest advantage. What they rode into was a wall of iron. The Almoravid front ranks dropped to their knees and planted the butts of their spears and javelins into the earth, angling the iron points upward at chest height for a charging horse. The Spanish war horses, massive beasts carrying armored riders, could not stop. They impaled themselves on the waiting points. Riders catapulted forward over dying animals and crashed into a shield wall of disciplined Berber infantry who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The cavalry charge, the most feared weapon in European warfare, dissolved into screaming chaos in a matter of seconds. And then the drums spoke. From behind the shield wall, the rhythmic thunder of Almoravid war drums rolled across the battlefield, and the rear ranks responded instantly. Coordinated volleys of javelins and arrows arched over the heads of the front-line infantry and rained down onto the stalled mass of Spanish cavalry. Knights who had survived the initial collision found themselves pinned between a shield wall they could not break and a storm of missiles they could not escape. Latin chroniclers who survived would later describe these tactics as treacherous and unknightly, as if war were a tournament with rules. But the Muslim chronicler Ibn Adari saw it differently. He described the flawless execution of a unified military organism, every part working in concert, every movement timed to the beat of the drums. Where the Christians saw treachery, the Almoravids saw genius. The Spanish knights who managed to dismount and fight on foot found themselves in an even worse position. They were exhausted from the charge. They were struggling to keep their footing on ground that had become slippery with blood. The Arabic sources use the word that translates roughly to treacherous footing, describing a field so soaked that men could barely stand. And the Almoravid infantry, calm, rested, fighting from prepared positions, ground them down with methodical, disciplined precision. This was not a battle anymore. It was a meat grinder. Then Yusuf played his final card. The drums changed their rhythm, and from behind the Almoravid lines, the Blackguard cavalry erupted. Thousands of light horsemen, fresh and unbloodied, swept around the flanks of the Spanish formation and crashed into Alfonso's exhausted army from two directions simultaneously. A second force of cavalry swung wide and struck the Spanish camp from the rear, setting fire to tents and slaughtering the reserves Alfonso had left to guard his supplies. In the space of minutes, the Spanish army found itself under attack from three directions at once. The drums kept beating. The Almoravid units maintained their coordination while the Spanish forces disintegrated into a mass of individual men fighting for individual survival with no coordination, no communication, and no hope. Alfonso's war banner disappeared. His camp burned. His reserves were dead or scattered across the plain. The king himself, wounded by a sword blow to the leg, managed to fight his way free and escape to Toledo on a fresh horse. But he left behind a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. Conservative estimates suggest Alfonso lost between 50 and 75% of his entire force. Of roughly 2,500 men who rode onto that field, fewer than 700 made it out alive. An entire generation of Castilian nobility, the armored knights who were supposed to be the unstoppable spearhead of the Reconquista, lay dead on the plains of Sagrajas, and the genius of Yusuf's plan extended even to the casualties his own side suffered. The troops he lost were overwhelmingly from the expendable Taifa contingent, the soldiers he had deliberately placed at the front to absorb the initial charge. His core Almoravid professionals, the Berber infantry and the Black Guard cavalry, remained largely intact. Alfonso had lost irreplaceable heavy cavalry that took years and fortunes to train and equip. Yusuf had lost auxiliaries he could replace within months. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Sagrajas is what happened after the battle. Despite having destroyed Alfonso's army, despite having the road to Toledo essentially open before him, Yusuf Ibn Tashfin did not press his advantage. He gathered his forces and returned to North Africa. He left Alfonso wounded but alive, clinging to Toledo with a shattered army and a shattered reputation. It seemed like madness, but it was calculated restraint. Yusuf understood that conquering Spain required more than military victory. It required administration, supply lines, political legitimacy, and time. He had demonstrated the power of the Almoravid military machine. He had proven that Christian expansion could be stopped, and over the next 4 years, he systematically returned and annexed the Taifa kingdoms one by one, replacing a patchwork of fragmented, tribute-paying emirates with a unified military state that stretched from Algiers to Lisbon. Alfonso VI never recovered. He held Toledo for the rest of his life, but he never made another major conquest. The Reconquista, which had seemed inevitable after the fall of Toledo in 1085, ground to a complete halt. A 30-year stalemate settled over the Iberian Peninsula, and the balance of power that had been tilting decisively toward Christian Spain snapped back with a violence that no one on either side had predicted. All because of one afternoon, one battle, and one 70-year-old desert commander who understood something that Europe's finest knights could not comprehend. Individual excellence, heavier armor, bigger horses, and personal bravery will always lose to coordinated discipline, tactical patience, and a commander who controls the battlefield before the fighting even starts. Yusuf Ibn Tashfin's drums, his psychological manipulation, and his layered tactical system turned every European advantage into a fatal weakness. It was a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare so effective that military historians still study it nearly 1,000 years later. And the knights who rode into that killing ground at Sagrajas never heard it coming until the drums were already beating.